أصحاب السمو والمعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، ضيوف دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة الكرام من كافة دول العالم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، وأسعد الله صباحكم بكل خير. تحت رعاية كريمة من سمو الشيخ طحنون بن زايد نائب حاكم إمارة أبوظبي مستشار الأمن الوطني، يسعدني أنا مريم الشامسي أن أكون معكم اليوم لتقديم فعاليات اليوم الأول لقمة إدارة الطوارئ والأزمات أبوظبي 2023 التي تنظمها الهيئة الوطنية لإدارة الطوارئ والأزمات والكوارث يومي 9 و10 من مايو الجاري. وتجمع القمة قادة وأكاديميين وعلماء متخصصين في مجال الطوارئ والأزمات والكوارث حول العالم بهدف رفع جاهزية منظومة الطوارئ والأزمات وتوحيد الجهود العالمية في القطاع وتسليط الضوء على مستقبل إدارة الطوارئ والأزمات في ظل التهديدات والمخاطر المتنامية حول العالم، بالإضافة إلى عقد مجموعة من ورش العمل التخصصية على هامش أعمال قمة إدارة الطوارئ والأزمات أبوظبي 2023. سيتم توفير خدمة الترجمة باللغتين العربية والإنجليزية من خلال السماعات المتوفرة في الخلف. ونستهل الساعات الأولى للقمة بالجلسة النقاشية الأولى تحت عنوان توظيف أدوات القوة الشاملة في إدارة المخاطر الوطنية، والتي تستعرض تكامل العناصر لمواجهة أي طارئ أو أزمة للتعامل معها بكل احترافية واقتدار. واسمحوا لي أن أدعو إلى المنصة كل من دكتور جو مو هينغ رئيس معهد استمرارية الأعمال في سنغافورة، السيد جيفري ساندرز الرئيس التنفيذي لشركة نورديك فورسايت، وسعادة جيمس موريس ورئيس أكاديمية ربدان. كما أدعو الإعلامية فضيلة السويسي من سكاي نيوز عربية لإدارة الجلسة، فلتتفضلوا جميعاً مشكورين. كما ننوه بأهمية مسح رمز الاستجابة لحصر تساؤلاتكم، وسيتم الرد عليها في نهاية الجلسة. شكراً.
أصحاب والسعادة، الحضور الكريم، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم، صباح الخير. أرحب بكم. أنا فضيلة سويسي من سكاي نيوز عربية، ويشرفني أن أدير هذه الجلسة، وهي تحت عنوان توظيف أدوات القوة الشاملة في إدارة المخاطر والأزمات. كما سبقت زميلتنا مريم الشامسي وقدمت ضيوف هذه الجلسة الدكتور جو مو هينغ رئيس معهد استمرارية الأعمال من سنغافورة، نرحب به. السيد جيفري ساندرز الرئيس التنفيذي لشركة نورديك فورسايتس من الدنمارك. ونرحب أيضاً بصاحب السعادة جيمس مورس رئيس أكاديمية ربدان. نبدأ إذن هذه الجلسة، ونتمنى أن تستمتعوا بالحوار الجاري مع السادة الكرام. أبدأ معك أولاً السيد جيمس مورس هذا الحوار، نفهم أكثر عن أدوات القوة الشاملة، وهو موضوع حديثنا اليوم. يا ترى ما هو مفهوم القوة الشاملة؟
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to be on this panel this morning. And thank you for the first question. The instruments of national power are, in effect, the sum of all of the capabilities, resources, and capacities of a nation to respond to an emergency, a crisis-type situation. It's a concept that's widely used throughout the world, and it can be used, obviously, to look in a structured way at risk management, national risk management. So it's a set of tools that form different frameworks. And if I just talk a little bit, if I may, about some of those frameworks, which will illustrate the point. In the US system, and used quite widely through the world, is the system of, they call DIMES. So it's diplomatic, informational, military, and economics. So they look at those as the instruments of national power that can be used to achieve national objectives. And normally these would be brought together through a national security strategy and led by the National Security Council, in this case here in the UAE, obviously the Supreme Council for National Security, looking at how to use all those instruments of power to achieve national objectives and to mitigate risks. And clearly on the risk side, you're looking at how you analyze the risks within that threaten your nation, both external and internal, and then you try and make sure that the instruments of power can be set against those risks. So one of the big challenges, of course, within all of this is the challenge of integration across all of the different areas of those national power, because if you treat them in isolation, you won't achieve the effect that you want, that joined-up national response in the case of an emergency or crisis. And so one of the particular challenges is about building relationships and trust within government. And so as the president of Rabdan Academy and as the academic partner for this conference, for which we're very honored, the Academy is a university here, and I'm just going to say a couple of words just to explain why I'm sitting on the stage. It's a university owned by the Abu Dhabi government whose primary purpose is to bring together young officers, members of the safety, security, defense, emergency management, and crisis response community, so they study together from an early age, and they build networks, they build understanding, they build trust. And I think trust we'll probably return to in this panel session, because trust between entities and individuals is critical. So the vision and mission for the Academy is all about promoting cooperation and coordination between individuals and entities so that they can work together into the future to integrate those elements, those instruments of national power. So I hope that's as a sort of introduction as to the instruments and how they fit into national risk management helps.
أعطيتنا فكرة سيد مورس، لكن سيد جيفري برأيك كيف يمكن استخدام أدوات القوة الشاملة فيما يتعلق بالأزمات والطوارئ؟
First, thank you all, distinguished guests and your excellencies, for having me here. This is a key question, I think, as to James' point. This is an integration problem, an integration challenge. And we have to think about it before, during, and after a crisis has happened, and the dynamic assessments that could be done in relationship to this. Oftentimes, when we do these these comprehensive assessments, it's about building relationships among the various stakeholders, because oftentimes different departments, the way we've siloed the way we deal with managing governance, managing crises, things like that, we've divided up the challenge across many stakeholders. And oftentimes we optimize according to those different silos, and we perceive the challenges and the problems differently. And so by bringing these comprehensive assessments together, you can start having conversations about how do we actually perceive the threats, the risks facing our organizations. How do we best manage that? How do we bring it to bear? And it's about having those conversations prior to a crisis emerging, understanding the language, the terminology, the rhetoric about how different institutions and stakeholders describe these challenges, threats, and solutions to them. And then you can start working towards understanding of actually what the problem is. And oftentimes when you have these challenges, the different segments of government, depending on the different level you're talking about, also with many of the challenges that we're dealing with, particularly with the inflection points of new domains, we're getting into cyber, we're getting into space, and those cut across our traditional management styles and different responsibilities where we're having to rely more and more on the private sector. How do we bring those stakeholders in to have these conversations? And tools like comprehensive assessment processes could help do that, bridge those gaps, build those understandings.
بما أنك سيد سوندرز ذكرت القطاع الخاص في هذه الجلسة يمثل القطاع الخاص الدكتور هانغ من سنغافورة، نرحب به مرة أخرى. دكتور هانغ، بما أن الأمر لا يعني فقط القطاع العام، يعني أيضا القطاع الخاص، كيف يمكن لهذين القطاعين العمل معا من أجل خلق نهج شامل ومتكامل في إدارة الأزمات والطوارئ؟
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for having me. Okay, the question it asks is whether how does the private and the public sector work together? I come from the private sector for all my life. One of the challenges you'll find is that there's no, I'm going to use it, there's no trust in the government in places where I come from in Asia Pacific. Reason is because the government will do what they want to do and then the private sector will just follow. But the private sector does not have the advantage of knowing exactly what is the step 1 to step 20 that the government is doing. I think to just sum it up, the most important thing is how do we, from the government sector, lay down the rules and say, hey guys, this is how we are going to do it. And your job is try your very best to come together. Remember, all the private sectors operate very differently. And the other second thing is they don't have no manpower. They have no manpower, so they allocate one person. A good example, most of you have seen in the world, COVID-19 has highlighted one very important item. There is not enough manpower. And like what Jeffrey has said, another thing, in the private sector, we work in silos. My job is to make more money, not to handle crisis management or business continuity. My job is to make more money, and hence we are organized this way. It's a requirement by the regulators to have it. However, if the regulator takes one step forward and say, hey, I want you to do this, like what we are doing now in Europe and the US, there's an operational resilience. Let's think of crisis management, business continuity, incident management, and the whole works together as one team. Before we develop business, before we talk to government, we think about can we prevent it? Can we build in the capability before it happens? This is very hard. Easy for me to tell you, but very hard to do. So that's basically to sum up. Trust, coordination, and a lot of government intervention. Thank you. Go. Is Dr.
سيد
Go.
مورس، عفوا. عند استخدام هذه الأدوات، ما هي العوامل التي يجب مراعاتها عند استخدام أدوات القوة الشاملة في إدارة الأزمات والطوارئ؟ وإذا أردت نأخذ أيضاً مثال على التجربة الرائدة لدولة الإمارات في مواجهة مثلاً أزمة كورونا تقريباً لمدة 3 سنوات.
Well, thank you for that question. And this will link neatly, I think, into Dr. Go's answer, because there are clearly risks that are faced by companies in the private sector, which are different to the risks faced by governments. Governments face the existential risks potentially to a nation, or those external threats, or crises of such an enormity that they are not similar in that way to the private sector, in my opinion. Therefore, governments always have this other responsibility that we all look to them when a major significant crisis finally emerges. And I think if to pick up on the question, what's interesting is that I talked about the DIME framework from the USA, but here in the UAE, and I think most of you will be familiar with the CEMS framework, which really looks at social community, information and media, military, political, economic, science and technology, and uses that framework. But what I find really interesting about it is the emphasis on social and community, and this will link into the COVID question. Because when you look at the resilience of nations and their ability to succeed and overcome crises and risks, you are looking at how, if you look at existential risks, it's about, let's say, the will to fight, if you're in a military context. It's about the society that you live in. If you face a pandemic, it's about the determination of the society to overcome it. And you'll notice that this is, this emphasis here in this framework, I think is very important, because it's often that determination and resilience of the community that makes all the difference. Think of the flooding in Fujairah, think of COVID, think of quite a lot of events that have happened externally. It's often about getting the community back on its feet if we're in disaster and crisis management. Let's say in New Zealand, if you look at the outcomes of the flooding in Australia, this is all about restoring communities' ability to deal with the problem. So if I use that framework to look at COVID, those of you who are living here, and I have had the privilege of living here in this country for 7 years now, who were here through COVID, will have seen how the government engaged with society so that we all collectively felt the correct route to overcome COVID. We were encouraged to work together, but to form effectively a team, a cohesive team, so that everyone felt responsible for doing their part in the COVID response. If you look through the rest of the framework, you look at the information that was passed by the government here, the continual flow of information, the media, the social media, the press conferences that were given to reassure us all of what was happening. So that instrument of power was being used there. If you look at the military role, slightly less in this circumstance, but you'll have seen the military supporting all sorts of other areas of government as they do, supporting the civil authorities as required. You look at the political, so you look at the diplomatic effort that the UAE government made, its relationship with vaccine suppliers, its ability to support nations in the region and throughout the world in vaccine supplies, the setting up of hubs here in the UAE as part of that resupply effort, the work between governments on travel, on trying to stop the spread of the disease. So the political and diplomatic tool was used enormously. You look at the economic tool, the support to business, the way that the government here was working with industries to help them produce PPE or produce vaccines or to produce the necessary food security that was required to see us through the pandemic. You can look at, if we go to the S, we look at science. You look at the research that was being done here into those areas of the vaccine and the precautions and the testing and the new technologies that came out there. But in technology, the final one of those instruments of power, think about how the national ID system was used to support the Al-Hosn app here in Abu Dhabi, and how technology through apps was used to enable the population to be kept safe. And so there, using the UAE's framework for analysis of national power tools, you can use the COVID pandemic as a classic example of how to bring those together under the Supreme Council for National Security and through NCEMA and the various organizations to keep a safe society, so to address that national risk.
سيد سوندرز، فيما يتعلق بتوقيت استخدام هذه الأدوات، تحدث السيد مورس عن تجربة دولة الإمارات الرائدة التي ربما كانت من ضمن التجارب الأولى عالمياً فيما يتعلق بالاستجابة السريعة. عموماً في إدارة الأزمات والطوارئ، كيف يمكن للحكومات والمنظمات المعنية العمل معاً بشكل فعال وفي التوقيت المناسب لإدارة الأزمات واستعمال هذه الأدوات لإدارة الأزمات والطوارئ؟
Well, I think that the COVID case is actually
I can give you mine, no problem.
Sorry for that. I think the COVID case is actually a fascinating case in this regard. And I'll do a comparative kind of a analysis between the experiences of what we had in the Nordics versus the experiences that you had in the UAE. And one of the consequences of that, in the Nordic region, talking about how do we deal and manage this requirement, they have a very particular Nordic flavor to it. And they call it the sector responsibility principle. So the sector that's most affected by a given crisis has a responsibility for managing and coordinating the rest of the response. And normally that works well if it's not a comprehensive crisis, societal crisis, which COVID was, that affected everything. And so all the countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they all had to go and switch their response. And now there's a new movement towards a Nordic research project actually on talking about what is societal safety, how do we bring that to bear, and how do we readdress our approach to resilience, to crisis and management, taking an alternative approach from the sector responsibility approach, which has been the way that they managed crises over the last 30 years, and actually bring it to a bear about how do we do this in a more coordinated, central fashion, and bring into bear to the concept that you're bringing in about the role of society. There's an expression that became very present in all the conversations that were being had, every news conference, which was, and I'll translate from Danish to English so you can have it in Arabic, which is the notion of samfundsen, and this societal awareness. So samfundsen, or societal awareness, was something that was called upon again and again to all the businesses, the individuals, to start taking their role in place. And I think when we talk about, and just building a little bit further upon the conversation, is that resilience triangle. To have a resilient society, you need to have resilient organizations, but you also have to have resilient individuals. And one of the things that the business community has had great benefit from is had great support from the government, but they also had great support from their workers who supported them through this, who transitioned to working from home, who started working longer hours, started working in different pay and variety and things like that, different conditions. And then also that support that the citizens gave back to their communities as well, in terms of being willing to front higher burdens of cost and things like that. So thinking about in these contexts in terms of our comprehensive power assessments is thinking not only about, in the dime-fill model, which you're speaking about, is very technocratic, very analytical, doesn't involve the community, focusing on community engagement, but also thinking about how do we bring the individual in response to this. I think that's some of the key factors which new technologies enable us to do that. When we see in different types of other crises, flooding, things like that, it's the community that brings in first responds and brings people in. And if they don't see the government reacting quickly enough, they're the ones that start taking action if we don't take action ourselves.
شكرا سيد جيفري ساندرز. بما أننا دائما نريد أن نطلع أيضا على تجربة القطاع الخاص وكيف عمل مع القطاع العام مع الدكتور هانغ. دكتور هانغ، كيف يمكن للقطاعين العام والخاص وضع استراتيجيات لتعزيز الاستجابة السريعة للطوارئ والأزمات؟
Thank you for the question. I think the first most important thing all of us must know is that each country has a different culture. Our culture drives the political system. Our political system drives how we manage a crisis and a disaster. So this is very important. So the challenge we have, especially coming from Asia, is that every country that we have has a different culture, different religion, different nationality, different race. And we are very different, and some are anarchy, some are democratic. So I think I want to start off with that. Please, we have to start off knowing who we are. It's very difficult to borrow from someone. Example, you can criticize China for locking out for 3 years, but can you see how many people died in China vis-a-vis the American? That sums it all. So the principle is very important. Like in Singapore, where we come from, we hated the government initially. The comment was very simple. Why you lock us down? So the final comment was, the principle was very simple. We want as little casualty as possible. And I myself have 5 doses of a COVID-19 shot. 5 doses plus 1 more because I got COVID. So 6. Okay, so culture is very important. So let's go back to how the private and public sector works together. I think there must be a legal framework, like what James and Jeffrey has just said. The legal framework frames out how we want to operate between interagency. The government itself is easy because you guys are in control. But when we come to a private sector, you have no control over me except a regulation. You will have a crisis management plan. You will have a business continuity plan. So what? I will give you one. But the most important thing is, based on that, how does the framework take us further? Like example, we need to do joint exercise. We need to take initiative, like what Jeffrey has said. A lot of government are now building capability to provide PPE. COVID is over, just announced 3 days ago. Why are we building more PPEs? Because my Prime Minister says there's a virus X coming on. Let's be ready. We are now ready, even in infrastructure. Everything is redesigned. If there's a COVID, we will go back to office, except we are 2 meters apart. We will be more resilient. I think that's the thing. So as a government, I guess the objective is the private sector has to be more resilient, but they are profit-driven. So it's very important that the whole concept, similar to green, being a sustainability, the same concept, is to actually get them to have some regulation, joint exercise with them. And for most of you, in Singapore, we had the most dangerous threat is terrorism. Surprise. We do joint exercise in our central business district every 2 years. There will be an attack. The second one we do is cyber attack. But we do a joint exercise with all the banks in Singapore. If you don't do that, there will be no coordination. It's not perfect, but there will be. So the second point is exercise. There should be some form of a joint exercise. And last but not least is technology. I think technology is something we take for granted. We have enough manpower. We have army, we have the police, in Singapore, we have the civil defense force. What's so big deal? We have capability, but technology matters a lot because just the ID alone that all of you are carrying, every country has some, that should be continued. And that allows me to show you that I have 5 shots of the dose. I'm going to walk through your custom, you are going to be safe. I think that's the kind of resilient ecosystem they want to build. Okay, thank you.
شكرا دكتور هانغ. بعد قليل يعني أدع المجال لطرح بعض الأسئلة من الحضور الكريم، لكن قبل ذلك دعوني مرة أخرى أعود إلى السيد مورس فيما يتعلق بتقييم استخدام هذه الأدوات. يا ترى سيد مورس، هل هناك آليات محددة يمكن استخدامها لتقييم مدى فعالية هذه الأدوات المستخدمة في إدارة الأزمات والطوارئ؟
Well, if I can just start by picking up on Dr. Goh's answer he just gave, because I think one of the big trends we've seen over the last decade or so is this shift of essential services into the private sector on a global basis. And I think one of the real challenges is understanding from a national perspective where one's risks truly lie. And how well can government understand risks in the whole supply chain into the private sector, where private sector inevitably, as we've heard, is interested in making money. They're interested in a resilient supply chain because their reputation depends on it, but they certainly don't want to overinvest in resilience because it costs them money. So I think one of the big challenges for governments looking globally is to understand their own system. And I would completely echo the point that, of course, every nation has a different approach to it. But some governments globally have outsourced a large amount of critical national infrastructure into the private sector. And the ownership of those elements of the critical national infrastructure is something you need to understand. But the supply chain for that part of your critical national infrastructure is clearly critical. And as we're facing a world which seems to be rather dividing rather than uniting at times with the risks to globalization, these upstream supply chain risks are, I think, a significant factor in trying to analyze national risks and try to decide how you use those instruments of national power to deal with crises. So how to actually test them was Fadila's question about how you bring them together, because there are various ways you can form constructs to do the analysis, and we heard a bit from Jeffrey about analysis of net assessment, of trying to understand the risks and how to bring them together. And so you create plans, which is the normal thing to do. Governments are good. The plan, of course, may not survive, as we'd say in the military, survive contact with the enemy, but the act of planning means that you bring all the correct people into the room and you sit down and you look at and analyze the problem, and even if the actual crisis is not the same as the one you planned for, the technique of planning itself will enable you to respond quickly in the case of an emergency. So you'll produce plans, and then the next stage normally is to run some tabletop exercises. Get everyone together, create a scenario, run your plan against the scenario, and learn some lessons. And you can assess your plans and your ability to respond through that. If that works, then you can move on to live exercises. And you see that happening, of course, in this country, but in many countries, bringing together all of those elements of national power together to actually run a scenario, and there have been many done in this nation to test plans and do the analysis afterwards. And it relies on, of course, a lot of the honesty in the feedback, because plans don't get improved if people don't provide the honest feedback. And so that system of testing through exercising, through tabletops is very important. And I would come back to my point about building trust, because it is trust that is so important when you face a crisis. You have to be able to know and understand your partner entities and agencies and your individual contacts. And at the senior level, those at the top of the organizations need to understand their fellow heads of their other organizations. So forming that integrated network of trust through tabletop exercises, through real-world exercises, and of course, then sadly, there are crises, and we test the nature of those relationships. But it's building trust, and trust is not something that can start on the first day of the crisis. Trust is something you invest in for many, many years to build it between organizations and people, so that you test that through the scenarios. But that's a good way of testing these things.
شكرا السيد مورس. يبدو بأن السيد سوندرز يريد التعليق على هذا السؤال منذ بداية إجابتك عليه. أعطيك الكلمة.
Oh, yes, and thank you for bringing these conversations about risk and kind of the challenges that we're facing and where they lie, because I think one of the big aspects that we've seen is some of the trends, which you've rightly pointed out, about the outsourcing of many activities from the public to the private, which faces and creates new dynamics about how we think about and manage different types of risks and are willing to invest in these aspects. But we also have to think about the nature of the challenges that are facing our societies. And one of the risks or weaknesses of these comprehensive approaches towards understanding threats is that we tend to over-focus on a systematic approach to understanding them. So we focus on challenges and threats that we already understand well, or we have a good sense of what they are. So they're kind of like our known unknowns. And we focus on those challenges and how do we deal and mitigate with those. And those are great. We put a bunch of best practice together. We put a bunch of good practice together. But right now we're dealing with a lot of transitional stresses and risks. You mentioned that we're dealing with some geopolitical contours, restructuring of the dynamics of global power, financial, military, informational, and the like. But we're also having a lot of transformational stresses. Highlighting the key importance of cyber and its integral component in just making our societies function, but the extreme vulnerabilities that are happening there because we're concentrating certain types of risks in that domain. The emergence of space, the importance of the electrification of the system, creating of new intelligent cities and creating interactivity in entirely new ways with our infrastructure and our critical infrastructure with those assets. So how do we deal with those emergent risks, those novel risks? Those are some of the things that the comprehensive assessment can help you understand where your strengths lie, but it's about building the relationships from those processes that enable you to know, who should I call? What type of conversation should we have around this topic so that we could develop emergent solutions towards this? And in the worst case scenario, in a truly chaotic situation, the novel practice of like, how do we act and who takes that first step and empowering them to do so. So I think these are some of the key aspects that are coming in and on the emerging front of this field.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think what's really interesting, if you look globally, that many nations had a pandemic at the very top of their national risk register, and yet most nations were not ready for it. And I think that sort of partly emphasizes the point you make there, Jeffrey, that even if you've identified the risk, sometimes you don't do anything about it. And so my point about plans and planning was that you plan against something you are comfortable with, a risk that you sort of think you understand, but it virtually never happens the way you think. It's virtually always something slightly different to that. The risks don't conform, or realities don't conform to your risk register, and therefore it's your ability to change and adapt to respond to the actual circumstances that is the key thing. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking, military-type operations. The enemy doesn't do what you want. That's the first thing about warfare. So whatever you think they might do, they almost certainly won't. But so the most predictable in some ways are those ones of natural disaster where actually you can forecast that it will rain and there will be flooding, because there is often. So some of those are predictable and some are very, very wide of the mark. Cyberspace, those sorts of areas. AI, we haven't talked AI, but I suspect AI is going to introduce a whole series of risks that we still don't really understand.
سؤالي الأخير قبل أن أفتح المجال لأسئلة الحضور الكريم للدكتور جو هانغ يتعلق بالتحديات التي يمكن أن تنشأ حين يتعاون القطاعان العام والخاص، وكيف يمكن معالجة هذه التحديات؟
Okay, I think the most important thing as a government, like what James has said, is first to identify some of the core threats. I give a very simple example. Before 2019, I was helping training people to old folks home, nursing home, and all this agency to actually do pandemic exercise. We lock up the old folks home, we lock up the nursing home, and guess what? The people come in, beat up the nurse, beat up everybody, scold them, kick them, and all these things. We were doing exercise for 3 years. That gentleman who is the director who says, I'm going to do it 3 years because we have about 300 old folks home and nursing home. If a panic comes out, we are going to have maximum casualty. I'm very proud to tell you, it took us 6 months before the first contamination in the first old folks home happened. I'm going to tell you, but it takes someone with guts to say, let's do it. Because nobody, like what James said, on the risk register, so what? Number one, so what? It won't happen until it happens. So this is something that I find that we need to actually come back to the risk register, take a pragmatic look, like what Jeffrey says, focus on some of the issues that are coming up. Something that cannot run away is natural disaster. I think that's something given. That the government can handle. I'm very confident. But the more important thing is what's happening next? Cyber attack. What happens if they bring down your power system? What happens if they bring down your hospital, like what happened in Korea? So that's something that you have to work with the hospital, the health agency, and then the government has to take over and manage the capacity, or especially the critical care to be transferred and so on and so forth. So this is the part where we start to go into the risk register and say, cybersecurity is one thing, natural disaster is given, supply chain is going to happen for a while, until even if the Ukraine war stops, we are going to have problem in Taiwan, in Asia, I'm going to tell you the truth. It's just when one ship is going to crash into another ship, and then there was going to be a fight. And then the whole 30% of the global shipping lines are being locked out in South China Sea and the Straits of Malacca, Singapore, and Malaysia. That is going to destroy the world in terms of supply chain because everything comes from China. So we begin to understand that, and these are all the threats that we have to think from the government. How the private sector has to do now is this. Based on your master plan as a government, I move forward and say, guys, this is what you have to diversify. Example, we have meat coming from 28 countries. We don't have anything in Singapore, 28 countries, and we just had there's a swine flu, and a lot of people die. I mean, the meat didn't come in. Singapore ran out of meat for 2 weeks, even though we have 28 sources. So how does the government take one step back and let's rethink and rework? So the few things is go back to your risk register, identify all this, and as a government, take a positive step. It will happen. Like in Singapore, there will be a terrorist attack. There will be a terrorist attack, even though a lot of people don't believe it. We will. And if you go to Singapore, there are young boys, 4 young boys carrying either Israeli Uzi or a P-series shotgun by the Germans. 4 young boys fully armed with shotguns. Because we think it's going to happen. But a lot of Singaporeans say, don't waste the taxpayer money. So I begin to understand, what I'm trying to emphasize is, as a government, take a stand, move on, and then hope that it doesn't happen to you. All right? That's my parting shot. Thank you.
تبقت دقائق معدودة قبل أن تنتهي هذه الجلسة. سأخصص ربما سؤالين أخيرين. أطرح أول سؤال على السيد سوندرز من الجمهور. السؤال يتعلق بأهم أداة من أدوات القوة الشاملة التي يجب الاهتمام بها أكثر.
Well, that's a tough question because I don't think there's really one tool to use this. We're talking about a multi-domain issue. So you have different areas of expertise, you have different tools of analysis for each of those sectors. I mean, we're talking about aspects related to societal cohesion. You can quantify some elements of that, but others are very qualitative in their approach. You have a whole list of different types of assessments, of course, about what are the different variables that you're looking at. What are your relative strengths and weaknesses in relationship to those, the types of risks that are involved from that, and then of course you have the element of bringing that future orientation into that. So you have some of the trend scanning and horizon scanning that we've been talking about. What are the things that we are emerging? And trends are just not only what new movements that we see, but also in the conversations that we've been having right now, which was just brought up about the concentration of risk. Some of our quests for efficiency have led to certain concentrations, whether it's on the generation of power, electrification of our societies, whether it's on concentration of sourcing of different materials, financial materials, supply chain risks, and things like that. And then what is our resiliency around that? So all of these aspects have a number of different tools that you have to use and bring to bear. And it's the challenge of the analyst to integrate them, but it's also equally important to think about the facilitation and the communication. One of the fundamental risks you see again and again and again from an analyst perspective, and I cut my teeth as you hear as an analyst, is that you put all this blood, sweat, and tears in producing this analytical report on your comprehensive national power assessment or whatever it may be, and it becomes, back in the day when I started my career, a proverbial doorstop. People think, oh, that's great, we did the work, we put it down, but no action was taken, no awareness was built. If you look at, as James said, all the countries of the world, a pandemic was the thing that they all talked about would be the fundamental risk. It was the top of the World Economic Forum's global risk assessments for over a decade, 20 years, probably even there. We did nothing about it. So it's the question about the transition from analysis to action that for me is that critical component. It's from the analysis, but it's also about the communication and the facilitation. How do we bring different experts together? Some of them who are very strategically oriented in their thinking, others who are very operational, who have their nose in the groove, thinking about what they need to deliver, and they're worried about their throat being the one being choked if things go wrong. But you have to be able to bring these people together because they're the ones that actually tell you where the stumbling blocks are and how you could address them in your legal frameworks, in your coordination with others, and that would be the aspects I'd focus on.
شكرا سيد سوندرز. صراحة سيد مورس عندي سؤالين، لكن عليك أن تختار واحد منهما لأنه تقريبا انتهى وقت هذه الجلسة. سأدع لك حرية الإجابة عن أحدهما. السؤال الأول يتعلق بكيف تؤثر البيروقراطية المعقدة على الأطر وعمليات صنع القرار. السؤال الثاني ربما أجبت عليه سابقا في طبعا سياق هذه الجلسة، كيف يتم تقييم كفاءة خطط الطوارئ والأزمات قبل البدء في إجراء التدريب والتمارين عليها.
Okay, thank you. I did talk a fair bit about the second question because it is actually a really interesting question because it picks up on what Jeffrey's just said. We talk in all of the risk methodologies, we talk about how we're going to treat them, transfer them, tolerate them. You know, there's all the jargon. But what often happens is what I actually describe as risk admiration, where we produce a risk register and we stand back and say that is a beautiful risk register, but we don't actually do anything about the risks. And I think that is a really interesting challenge to us. Some of the risks just are just too nasty, or too difficult, or in some cases too expensive, or in different systems. The chances of them happening within let's say, a political cycle is so low that governments won't invest in them because they won't get the political reward for it. And so that issue of risk and reward is a very interesting one. We don't often talk about the reward. And I would say, if you look on the military side of things, I'll use it as an example as we have some military people. You know, if you're trying to capture something, how much risk will you take in trying to capture it? Well, the only way of answering that is, what is the reward for capturing it? So it's very important to understand what you get for carrying a risk, or what you are prepared to pay to write down that risk. So in terms of evaluating your plans and trying to work out whether they will work, you are looking at those risk scenarios, but you often need to bring in academics and other people to write challenging scenarios, the ones that you might not have thought of, and then you try and run them and see whether your response will actually work. Because if you just run, if you think of a risk and then you just literally run just against that risk, your plan will probably work. But where it may not work is when things don't happen as you expected. And that's why you have to be very honest with yourself about how you're dealing with the risks you actually face. And you need to run them through, as I say, you can run them through a series of simulations, you can run scenarios, techniques looking forward, using foresight-type techniques of future scenarios. Get some academics and people who understand to write, and ask them to write challenging scenarios for the unexpected, and then put some injections into it as if it was a proper exercise scenario, and see how the system responds to those. And then normally, the way I've seen it done before, you have some observers who stand back and they just watch to see what is happening. And it's very important that they then produce honest reports to enable the team who are trying to respond to improve. And that's these are fairly normal techniques. A lot of you will have practiced them before. But it is, as I would observe, it's about trying to get that honest feedback about what really does work and what doesn't work. And what is, as you look at it, how you better understand the risks that you face through that sort of exercise tabletop. And tabletops are really good, where you just sit in a room. You don't have to get all the people out on the ground. You can run through it in the room and put injections in. And there's a lot of computer-based systems that will support this. There are a lot of techniques there, but they can all be used to support that.
شكرا جزيلا لك السيد جيمس رئيس أعلامية ربدان. أشكر أيضا ضيفينا الآخرين السيد جيفري سوندرز الرئيس التنفيذي لنورديك فورسايت من الدنمارك، أشكره. كما أشكر أيضا دكتور جومو هانغ رئيس معهد استمرارية الأعمال في سنغافورة. أشكركم جميعا، أشكر الحضور الكريم أصحاب المعالي. نتابع معكم ما تبقى من جلسات هذه القمة. شكرا.
كل الشكر والمشاركين في الجلسة النقاشية الأولى على الحقائق والمعلومات القيمة التي استفدنا منها جميعاً في كيفية إدارة المخاطر الوطنية. نود التنويه بتقييم الجلسة من خلال مسح رمز الاستجابة السريع على الشاشة. والآن ندعو سعادة عبيد راشد الحصان الشامسي نائب رئيس الهيئة الوطنية لإدارة الطوارئ والأزمات والكوارث إلى المنصة لتكريم متحدثي الجلسة الأولى. فليتفضل سعادته مشكورا. دكتور جومو هانغ رئيس معهد استمرارية الأعمال في سنغافورة. السيد جيفري ساندرز الرئيس التنفيذي لشركة نورديك فورسايت. سعادة جيمس موريس رئيس أكاديمية ربدان. والإعلامية فضيلة سويسي إعلامية من سكاي نيوز عربية. شكراً للجميع.